afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the weekly webinar. I am Kelly G. Lowe, your Community Engagement Coordinator and the weekly webinar host. We are excited to have you here today for our session on neuroplasticity, rewire your brain at any age. And I know those of us in Kansas City woke up to some surprise snow this morning, and I personally would like to rewire the weather so that doesn't happen anymore. I'm not sure that's possible, but I'm excited to hear what Rosie has to say about brain neuroplasticity. So I'll tell you a bit about her. Rosie helps facilitate and maintain the ADRC's LEAP program, and she has a Bachelor of Arts in Cognitive Science and Philosophy from Beloit College. And she is going to give us some really useful information, I'm sure, about neuroplasticity. And a few housekeeping notes. Of course, you can enable the closed captioning at the bottom of your screen at any time if you'd like to have that help you follow along with the presentation. We'll ask you to keep yourself on mute throughout the presentation. If you have questions, feel free to use the chat function, and I will watch that as Rosie presents and make sure that we get all your questions answered. And we'll probably leave questions for the end, and then Rosie can address those. And as always, this presentation will be available on our YouTube channel within 24 hours, so that if you want to watch it again and or share it with anyone else you know, you are more than welcome to do that. So with that said, Rosie, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to you. And thanks everybody for being here.
Okay. Thank you guys so much. Let me just share my screen real quick. I'm excited to talk to you about this topic. It is one of my favorites. I'm sorry, just a second. Having some PowerPoint difficulties. That's not the best way to start, but there we go. Okay, let me full screen and present. Okay, thank you for that introduction. Again, my name is Rosie and I'm the LEAP program assistant. So I work on our Lifestyle Empowerment for Alzheimer's Prevention program, where we help teach healthy lifestyle strategies to improve and protect brain health. Neuroplasticity is a pretty hot topic in brain science, and it's also pretty misunderstood, but it is very important for understanding how to improve your brain health and why some of these methods that we talk about at the ADRC or at the LEAP program are so helpful, or at least can be. And so that's what I'm gonna talk to you about today. The main things that we're going to cover are sort of defining neuroplasticity more specifically and talking about its roles. We'll also discuss the main building blocks of neuroplasticity, what goes into it, how it relates to Alzheimer's disease, other types of dementia, as well as other brain issues. We'll talk about how to promote neuroplasticity to help improve and protect your brain health. And we'll have some study examples and discussion. So in short, neuroplasticity is your brain's ability to restructure itself in response to information or injury. And this is an essential feature of your brain at all stages of life. So if you think about sort of what your brain really is, it's a whole lot of brain cells or neurons that are arranged in these different ways with information that passes through them in the form of chemicals and electricity. And so the physical arrangement of those brain cells determines things like your habits and your behaviors and even your thoughts. Neuroplasticity is the specific ability to respond, for your brain to respond to changes in the environment or even in itself to alter how those neurons connect to each other. It's key to your brain's adaptability, especially when it comes to disease, but it isn't only related to that. For example, as we'll talk about, every time you learn something new, the connections in your brain change, and that is an example of neuroplasticity. Here you'll see an illustration of some neurons developing new connections. Now this is actually a model. It is not sort of they're not real images, but I think it's a sort of cool demonstration. Neuroplasticity has been a hot topic in brain science for quite some time. And sort of at one point it was seen as this holy grail for brain health, but it does have plenty of limits. However, I am excited to share its role in prevention and symptom management with you. And one thing about it that I think is very important that relates to the limits and the benefits is that neuroplasticity is not an exclusively positive phenomenon. Your brain doesn't want to be as plastic as possible. It actually wants to balance stability with plasticity. So, for example, a hypothetical brain that was completely plastic would not be able to retain any new information at all. Even a newborn baby, for example, whose brain is, essentially a sponge, has some level of brain stability, things that are resistant to change, and will sort of process the world in the same way so that it has kind of a standard by which to compare new information to. On the contrary, someone who had a completely stable, unchanging brain would not be able to learn anything at all. So as I was saying before, your brain physically changes every time that it encodes a new memory as new connections are being formed. A person whose brain could hypothetically not adapt at all wouldn't form any new memories. And you might have sort of noticed this in the word, right? But a plastic is a specific type of material that can either change form or hold its previous form depending on circumstances, often temperature. So obviously your brain is not literally plastic, but this is why we call this phenomenon neuroplasticity. So this balance relates to our life cycle. And as you probably have noticed, kids can learn positive skills and habits very quickly, but they actually will often learn harmful habits just as easily, or retain sort of harmful or damaging things or be more affected by them. And this actually relates to the fact that in general, with plenty of exceptions, we're more vulnerable to traumatic events in early childhood. So again, we want to sort of keep that balance between plasticity and stability. And it matters and is generally good that brains are a bit less adaptable in adulthood, because this helps us to preserve strategies and insights that we've collected over the years. That said, most adults could benefit from increasing their neuroplasticity somewhat, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about in a bit here. In case you're curious, I wanted to talk about some of the stages of neuroplasticity and how it changes throughout your lifetime. In childhood, as I said, we are highly plastic, and there are many critical periods. I forget the specific ages, but these are basically periods during, especially early childhood, where you your brain learns certain functions and is very open to learning them that then cannot be learned later or that are harder to learn. So that was very vague. For example, vision is one thing that is very dependent on this critical period in childhood. If a child is born with a cataract that's not corrected within the first months of their life, they will likely have impaired vision for the rest of their life, for example. Similarly, language has some interesting critical periods. There's new research that suggests there are some later, like in adolescence, critical periods that are very important to language as well. But especially in childhood, right, you, in most cases, will never learn an additional language sort of better than the ones that you were born speaking, even if you grew up speaking a very, very difficult language. Then in adolescence, I won't go into this too much because I specifically don't know a whole lot about adolescent neuroplasticity, but the main thing that I've learned recently is that, so while adolescence is obviously a time of great change, neuroplasticity during this time is not that well understood yet. There is a critical period from about 12 to 15 where it's hypothesized that higher cognitive functions develop. And interestingly, neuroplasticity is mediated by sex hormones. So there are some sex differences in when and how much neuroplasticity evolves during adolescence. That's not well understood yet, though. Then in adults, there are no critical periods left as far as I'm aware. But contrary to what we used to believe, adults continue to generate new neurons in the hippocampus, which is important for learning and memory, the olfactory bulb related to smell, and the neocortex, which is sort of the outside shell of your brain. Well, I guess that would be your skull. It's the outside layer of your brain where a lot of new memories are sort of consolidated. In older adulthood, interestingly, that plasticity that's in early and mid-adulthood continues. It is a little bit lower, but again, that plasticity, for example, in the hippocampus does continue. And this is important and new research because first people thought that neuroplasticity ended in childhood, then they thought it ended in mid-adulthood, and now in general, it continues through your entire life. There is age-related cognitive decline in older adulthood, as well as some skills that continue to improve across most of older adulthood, especially vocabulary. That doesn't really have a sort of peak age. Also, this is kind of a personal question, but if you think of general contentment as a cognitive skill, which could be related to emotional regulation, this increases on average in older adulthood, of course, depending on your circumstances. Last thing about older adulthood is that for reasons that are not super well understood, there is more symmetrical brain activation when doing just general tasks than in earlier stages of life. And this may contribute to heightened creativity and holistic thinking in older adulthood. So that was an overview of some of the changes that happen in our brains throughout life, especially in relation to neuroplasticity. Now I'll talk a bit about the two main roles of neuroplasticity and how they work. So the first main role is learning from new experiences, and the second role is regaining or maintaining function after injury. I think that it's kind of funny that people thought until very recently that neuroplasticity was only available to children, because we understand that all learning restructures the brain. So for an example, as you're watching this presentation, some of your brain cells are being activated, some connections are being strengthened, others are being weakened, and these connections will be reactivated when you remember this information. Learning is a form of neuroplasticity. Importantly, and this is a fact that makes me happy, not all learning happens when you're working with the information. So if there's a problem in your life or you're working on a project and you're just stuck on it, and then you find out that overnight a solution came to you, you feel closer to understanding what's going on, your brain has literally worked on it overnight. Those connections are continuing to be activated, and more complex connections may form even if you're not working with the information consciously. So in addition to learning, the other important role of neuroplasticity is helping you regain function after injury. So injury here, that we'll talk about dementia in a minute, usually refers to something like a traumatic brain injury. So for example, a blunt force injury from a car accident or oxygen deprivation from a stroke. Here we have an example of Broca's area being damaged in a stroke related to language. And in this specific person, this is a real scan, the equivalent area on the right side of their brain was recruited in order to help the person perform the functions that were affected by the stroke. There are two other types of adaptation to injury that I'd like to talk about. The first is acute psychological injury, and this is sort of a complex topic that I can't get into right now. For better or for worse, your brain can have pretty radical and sometimes quick reactions to trauma, trying to essentially find more stable mental ground after a difficult experience happens to you. Some of this may allow one to bounce back. Some of this may sort of perpetuate or cause coping mechanisms that might not be the most beneficial in the long term. But I wanted to highlight that just because even though it's obviously different from an acute physical injury, it's a similar mechanism. Another, as we'll talk about, is damage from Alzheimer's disease or other types of dementia. So in Alzheimer's, for example, the buildup of amyloid proteins. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the role of neuroplasticity in preventing Alzheimer's disease specifically. Essentially, We've talked about how the brain balances adaptability and stability, and by making healthy choices, we can help our brains achieve that right level of neuroplasticity to reduce disease risk. The general rule, right, even though I talked about sort of the benefits and drawbacks of neuroplasticity, is that if you're helping your brain to be healthy, it will find that balance itself, or sort of try to. So of course, there are many factors that contribute to Alzheimer's disease, and solely optimizing your neuroplasticity will not necessarily prevent or slow disease progression in everyone. It's a very complex disease. But promoting the health of the whole brain to encourage neuroplasticity can really help reduce disease risk or slow progression. And here's sort of specifically why that is. So some of the risk factors for Alzheimer's disease include having neurons that are more susceptible to damage. This is often due to inflammation. High levels of inflammation in the body. This can be caused by stress. It can be caused by cardiovascular disease and other things. Struggling to generate new neurons, the term for that is neurogenesis, the creation of new neurons, and not having enough pre-existing connections for adaptation to damage. So for example, this is a little hard to explain. I wish I thought about how to explain it better earlier. But if you use your brain often, if you have many different skills, all of the areas of your brain become better adaptable to sort of stepping in for damage. So your brain loves to recruit healthy areas to make up for the damage. And if you're using your brain often, if your brain is, its different parts are used to working together, you'll be better able to recruit additional areas when you face damage to help maintain or restore the lost functions. In Alzheimer's disease or with Alzheimer's risk, just like with a traumatic brain injury. So by increasing your neuroplasticity with some of the strategies I'll talk about, you can help your neurons be more resilient. You can decrease levels of inflammation. You can promote neurogenesis, and you can use those pre-existing connections to help mitigate damage. There are two main ingredients to help your brain get that appropriate level of adaptability. So I'll go over what they are and sort of some of the main ways to boost them. The first one is neuron health and regeneration, and these are kind of the building blocks of neuroplasticity. So if you want to be able to rewire your brain in response to injury, you need to have healthy neurons in the first place. Then after that, much of the actual rewiring depends on the environmental factors and challenges to which your brain responds. So in general, once you have those building blocks, the rewiring itself needs to be triggered by something, and that's where the cognitive engagement outside stimulation comes in. So let's talk about neuron health and regeneration for a minute here. Kids make a whole lot of new neurons, and as I said, scientists used to think that adults did not, but we do specifically generate new neurons in the hippocampus. And this may be important specifically for dementia prevention, although that is not necessarily confirmed. It's not confirmed because both the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex are often affected in dementia. So the fact that we can generate new neurons there in the hippocampus, which is very important for memory and learning and emotion regulation, may potentially serve as protection against dementia. And in case you didn't know, the hippocampus is shaped like a seahorse. Some specific ways to promote that neuron health and regeneration include the following. The most important thing, and I don't really say that lightly because many things are important here, but maybe getting enough physical activity and aerobic exercise. Physical activity, which includes just walking around doing household tasks and things, as well as exercise, can help strengthen your executive function and your memory by improving oxygenation to the brain, among many other reasons, even without any or much sort of cognitive effort on your part, of course, depending on the task that you're doing. There's also evidence that aerobic exercise specifically may increase something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which encourages your brain to produce new neurons, and that's very important. Now, I will say that the research there is mixed, so I can't, affirm that for certain. But in any case, we know that aerobic exercise and physical activity are some of the things that are most important for promoting your neuron health and helping you create new neurons. In addition, getting enough omega-3s or healthy fats is very important to support your neuron health. Your brain contains lots and lots of fat. It thrives off of these fats, especially those that are anti-inflammatory, like omega-3s. Omega-3s are very important for the health of neuron membranes specifically, so that neural integrity, and they also help control inflammation. So these omega-3s are found in things like fatty fish and nuts and seeds. We talk more about good sources of omega-3s in our Mediterranean diet course, by the way. One last thing that I'd like to mention that I didn't include on this slide, but that's also important, is stress management. And stress management is stressful for me personally, because if you hear that stress can potentially do some harm to your body and brain, it makes you more stressed. But it is true that stress can increase your risk of Alzheimer's disease and other conditions. And this is at least partially explained by the fact that stress increases inflammation. Your hippocampus, that one region I was just talking about, is extremely sensitive to cortisol, and you can actually shrink your hippocampus from too much chronic stress, though it is, I think, completely reversible in a lot of people. So, that's a cool fact. Another thing about stress is that it may hamper your sort of willingness to have new experiences, understandably, if you're very stressed out, focusing on something specific, or just live a high stress life. And that openness to new experiences is important for helping rewire your brain through new activities and continued stimulation. So with those building blocks in mind, those make it easier for your brain to rewire yourself as needed to protect itself against injury and help you continue to learn and be sharp. So you may have heard about the idea of cognitive reserve, which is sort of what I was talking about earlier. If you have a sort of, for lack of a better term right now, well-developed brain with lots of different types of connections from many different activities, especially activities that recruit multiple parts of the brain, your brain will be better able to rewire itself when it faces an injury, because there's just more stuff for it to take and use to help restore those old functions. Even if not all of, even if that specific area, for example, could not be healed, your brain kind of gets creative and pulls resources from other parts of the brain, also can help you come up with different solutions for certain issues you may be facing, or rather other ways to do things that may have become challenging for whatever reason. So in order to keep our brains adaptable, first of all, I want to say that any activity that you enjoy, well, generally speaking, that's stimulating, is going to be better than not doing anything. So don't worry that just because, for example, you might not play an instrument or be interested in learning a new language, just by spending time with someone new, going to a new place, doing things like that regularly, little things, it can really help improve your neuroplasticity. But that said, if you're looking to maximize it, we want to focus on activities that challenge several different parts of the brain at once. So creative activities are a good example of this, stuff like art and writing. And so are skills that combine movement with problem solving, stuff you probably may already do, like cooking or building or organizing things. And finally, social engagement, while it's technically part of cognitive engagement, has benefits that you can't get from doing activities on your own cognitively. So we really recommend combining that cognitive engagement, those activities you like, with your friends, teaching your friend about a new topic, trying your friend's hobby or passion, exploring a new place with friends or family members, even just talking to a stranger. All that stuff is very good for your brain. Finally, I just wanted to say here that productive engagement is more beneficial than passive engagement. And what I mean by that is that if you are really involved in the activity you're doing, as opposed to, say, watching a show or reading, though those can be active activities at some points, you're more likely to cognitively benefit from the activity. So things that really force you to be engaged, to think through something and do it yourself, as opposed to just taking it in, are very, very good for your brain. Lastly, I wanted to just mention some studies. I won't actually show the whole articles here because we don't have time for that. But these are study examples related to neuroplasticity, specifically in older adults. So this is evidence that new hippocampal neurons continue to form. Cardiorespiratory fitness, so engaging in aerobic activity, has a direct link to the amount of oxygen you're getting in your prefrontal cortex, as well as your general mental fitness. Not all, but many studies show that supplementing omega-6s and omega-3s together help promote cognitive function. Sports like dance can help promote cognitive function. And as you may or may not already know, individuals who have the plaques that form in Alzheimer's disease, they can vary a lot in symptom severity. So, and this is for many reasons, but so for example, one person who has a moderate amount of plaques may have retained a wider variety of cognitive functions than a different person with that same amount of plaques. And one potential contributing factor is that cognitive reserve hypothesis. So that idea that the first person may have had more reserve, more different parts of the brain to pull from to make up for some of the damage. Then finally, as I said, physical activity may increase production of that brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which stimulates your brain to create new brain cells in the hippocampus. All right, thank you for experiencing that. I would love to hear your questions, but just real fast, because I am with the LEAP program and I think it's cool. I wanted to tell you a little bit about our upcoming programs. So, the LEAP program offers two main classes where we talk about lifestyle factors that help influence and protect brain health. And our main course, Brain Health Bootcamp, is going to start on February 13th. It's 6 weeks long, it's free, it's totally online at this time. And it covers several different lifestyle factors, including cognitive engagement, social engagement, exercise, stress management, and lots of the things I mentioned today. And what we do is that we help participants set specific goals related to these different areas so that you can start to feel a difference or see a difference in your brain health or help protect your brain health. It's open to anyone. And if you would like to join, I will put a link in the chat. Last but not least, we also offer our Mediterranean diet course, which is 4 weeks long, starting March 23rd. And so our director, Rachel Sandoval, is a dietitian. This is her main thing. And this course consists of live Zoom classes where we talk about all of the nutritional aspects of brain health that are most important to know. We also have lots of meal guides and resources and recipes, as well as a weekly recipe challenge, which I think is quite fun. That's it. Thank you very much. Does anyone have questions, thoughts, comments, etc.?
Thank you so much, Rosie. I hope you saw the comments about your presentation being great in the chat. If not, I'm telling you. And I say
Thanks,
ditto.
Joan.
I echo. Very good job. I feel like my brain is more plastic already. Maybe not plasticer, but anyway, thank you very much. You gave us a lot to think about. Elaine is asking what our omega-6 is. So if you wouldn't mind giving us a quick explanation.
So omega-6 is one specific type of fat that we need, that you can only get through food, and that is oh, right, sorry, hold on, let me use my brain. So omega-3s are the ones that are considered healthy because they're anti-inflammatory. And omega-6s are the ones that are sometimes considered less healthy. These are two similar types of fats because they do promote inflammation. However, so omega-6s, which are found in things like red meat and butter, for example, are necessary in moderate quantities because your body needs inflammation in order to protect itself from things like infection. And so the reason why we emphasize omega-3s over omega-6s in general is because most people get too many omega-6s and not enough omega-3s, so they have too much inflammation. But you do need both of them. I hope that that answered your question.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again, Rosie. This was really excellent, as I knew it would be. Thank you all for joining. We'll be back here next Thursday, and our topic next Thursday is caregiver support. And so I know we'll get some good tips there. In the meantime, give us an email if you have questions at myalliance@kumc.edu. I do see one more question, Rosie, if you don't mind, in the chat. About vegans.
Yes, that's a good question. And I'm not an expert here, but things like nuts and avocado and olive oil, which are vegan, are great sources of omega-3s. In terms of omega-6s, I believe, sorry, I wish I was more knowledgeable about this, but I believe that things like cheese substitutes, butter substitutes, and lots of other vegetable oils like canola oil, which are also vegan, are sources of omega-6s as well. If you eat, oftentimes as a vegan, you may have to eat sort of some more processed foods, although that obviously depends. But those many processed foods contain a lot of omega-6s. So in general, I would assume that vegans get fewer omega-6s, which is probably good, but there are still sort of plenty of sources of omega-6s. And it looks like we have an additional research in the chat, which looks helpful. Thank you, Maria. Yeah, so I am not an expert on nutrition, but that was my attempt. You're welcome.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much again, Rosie, and everyone for being here. And we'll look forward to seeing you next week. And we'll send the My Alliance Monday email on Monday. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.